Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Teresa, and also thank you to Jessica Wyndham and the AAAS staff for putting on a most wonderful 10th anniversary coalition meeting. Congratulations on 10 wonderful years. We're looking forward to the next several decades of championing science and human rights, so best wishes. I also am very grateful to see so many new people joining us in celebrating science and human rights and moving the work forward, so I welcome all of our new participants and, of course, our old friends and colleagues as well who've been working so hard on science and human rights. Well, tonight I have the great pleasure of introducing our featured speaker. Francella Ochillo is the Executive Director of Next Century Cities, a nonprofit organization focused on ensuring that every American has access to fast, affordable, and reliable broadband. She works to support local connectivity solutions and creates opportunities for local leaders to participate in federal policymaking. Previously the Vice President of Policy and General Counsel for the National Hispanic Media Coalition, Francella is a digital rights advocate who is committed to expanding digital opportunities for the unserved and underserved. She has worked on a variety of technology and telecommunications issues with a specific focus on assessing the impact of policy proposals on marginalized populations. In her current role, Francella continues to help policymakers and lawmakers understand how broadband access can change socioeconomic outcomes and revitalize communities. Her most recent publications address the ties between income inequality and America's digital divide and can be found in the October 9th edition of Axios, and with Angela Seifer from the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. Francella also wrote about digital access and skills training in the October 12th issue of Tennessean. So please join me in a warm welcome of our featured speaker, Francella Ochillo.
I'm trying to make sure how I change the screen. Oh, great. Well, hi there, you guys. Good evening. My name is Francella, and I'm so thankful that Teresa extended an invite for me to come. And also, thank you, Cheryl, for that very warm introduction. And I'm really excited to hear that you guys are celebrating 10 years of science and human rights. My organization is actually approaching our 5-year anniversary. And as Cheryl mentioned, we are a nonprofit coalition of cities across the United States. We have over 200 member municipalities, which are cities, towns, counties that are all united in their commitment to essentially provide universal broadband access for their residents. We believe that high-speed, reliable internet access is something that every single American deserves, and we are constantly trying to make the case for why high-speed access and universal access is something that is directly tied to opportunities to improve educational outcomes, health outcomes, to make sure that people have opportunities to start businesses and have economic mobility, and most importantly, for them to be able to participate in our democracy. I want to make sure that I tell you that the views that I'll share with you today go beyond the scope of the work that I do at Next Century Cities. I have actually worked on studying various populations of how tech and telecom policies impact populations, including communities of color, low-income populations, hard-to-reach populations. And what I'm constantly thinking about is how do we take those issues from being case studies and being able to humanize those stories. So when I share my views with you today, I just want to remind you that this is a reflection of my analysis, not necessarily a reflection of our members or our organization. And it is specifically to ask for all of us to think about what exactly is our call to action when we're in this room to dial into this issue. I want to make sure that I revisit something that was mentioned. I believe Nadia was asked a question about bias in algorithms, and it reminded me of a conversation that I had with Kathy O'Neill. She wrote Weapons of Math Destruction, and that is something where she talks very eloquently about how people just trust math because you can trust numbers. And I think it's really important for us to think about when we're talking about some of the problems with AI, it is not just just about the numbers, because quite frankly, if Silicon Valley wanted to solve the problem with diversity in tech, they would. They found a way to put Wi-Fi on the moon. They have found a way to make flying cars. So if they wanted to make that a priority, they very much could. I want to go back to, as Cheryl shared a little bit about me, I am a lawyer, I am a digital rights activist, and I am extremely passionate about making sure that people have access to technology. I speak on behalf of people who are disconnected and disenfranchised, specifically because when I'm here in DC, I realize that a lot of them don't have either the capacity or the agency to participate in the models that govern them. So I believe that when we do have the opportunity to speak on behalf of the lesser among us, that we should. As I look around the room today and I think about when we're looking at scientists and human rights leaders, and we're thinking about even everyday citizens, there are lots of opportunities for us to dial in on this conversation, because the truth is that a lot of the opportunities that we're talking about for people do not exist if they do not have an opportunity to participate in a digital economy. And as we think about something that I always want to make clear, as we shift from a goods and services economy in most places into a knowledge-based economy where everything is based on having direct access to being able to have a digital profile, or even really simple things like I was talking to someone who was using the Lifeline program, and they said their email address is their only steady address. And really thinking about, what does that mean when that is the only steady address that you have? And that's the only way that you can get government services, or to be able to actually sign up for health benefits that maybe you were entitled to from the VA. These are things that we have to be able to humanize these stories to understand, why does it matter? So I always go back to something that Commissioner Rosenworcel, who has really been a champion for speaking up for people who really can't speak for themselves, and she always comes back to the fact that the future belongs to the connected. And it's something that I don't think is just in theory or hyperbolic. I honestly believe that the people who are not connected will easily be left behind. So that brings me to our exercise now. I know that some of you are feeling like, I just came to watch, I'm not interested in moving, I have no intention of making new friends, I don't even like people. That's fine. That's okay. But I am in the room with extraordinary thinkers, and you guys have amazing stories to share. So everyone has a sheet of paper that Teresa has passed out to you. Listen carefully. If you have a sheet that says digital, you are going to introduce yourself to someone else that's digital, and you're going to tell them what they'd find about you on your online profile. If you have analog, you say nothing. Let's go. You have 90 seconds. If you have digital, you are finding another person that has digital. You'll tell them what they will find on your online profile. So if I were to do a Google search, what would I find? You're a world-renowned professor. You love puppies. You bake cupcakes. If you haven't had an opportunity to hear from your neighbor, find out from them. So once you found out what they're going to find out about you online, you can find your way back to your seat. And I do want to make sure that I get feedback from the people who got to share something interesting. If you found out a really interesting fact about your neighbor, that's fantastic as well. If you were part of the group that was digital, did anyone find out something really interesting about someone nearby? You found out that they published a paper and you had been stalking them online. I do that all the time. Actually, I'll be honest with you. I'll actually tell the story of how I met Kathy O'Neill. So I was reading her book, and I read all the time, and I was having this conversation about AI. I was at the leadership conference on 16th Street, and I found out I didn't know she was like such a big deal back then. It was really hard to get her to book, and she had an agent. I was like, I don't even know what to do with this. So I wrote her an email, then I wrote her agent an email, and then I wrote her an email telling her that I emailed her agent, and I wrote all of them to say, please come down to Washington, D.C. 6 emails later, Kathy O'Neill did come down to 1620 L Street. That's how I met her. So for someone who found out something interesting about your neighbor, stand up, tell me what it was. Yeah?
My neighbor is actually from Berlin, yes. And so she said I would find out about her work in Berlin.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. I'm glad to see you. Did anybody else find anything interesting? Stand up. Yeah.
My neighbor described herself as an undisciplinarian.
Oh, I love that.
This is from Virginia Military Institute and asked very interesting questions about space.
That's awesome. Undisciplinarian, I am a disruptor. It's good to see you. Okay, stand up, please.
My neighbor
great.
taught me to stand.
Oh, that's great.
My neighbor told me that she's Googled herself, and she's the only person online in the U.S. with her particular name.
That's amazing. Oh, fun facts. That's great. Anybody else got anything? What about the people who were analog? Stand up. Tell us your thoughts. Or you can yell it out. It's fine.
I just overheard some interesting conversations. That's my experience.
And I think what I wanted to illustrate there is that when we think about the population in general on the planet, we have just shy of 80% of the planet that has some access to being online, but there's 20% of the people who live in complete silence. They don't know how to find each other. They might overhear information, but it's really hard for them to plug in. Even if they wanted to sign up for information, they have to go through, maybe take buses to get across town. It's a little bit more difficult to do something that we can do on our phones. And sometimes I think it's important that for those of us who have a phone, a laptop, an iPad, all of those things within our reach, to remember that 20% that has nothing, and they live in an echo chamber where even though their stories are just as rich and beautiful and valuable, they live in this silence. And so we have to find ways to actually build bridges out of those places if we're transitioning into a digital society. Please share.
So I do speak English, and I consider myself as I'm fluent in English, but it's not my first language. And when I was given analog, I didn't know what it meant. So I immediately Googled because I know it would be part of the conversation, and I see that it's a comparison between two things nowadays. So I was able to participate in this just now because I have the access to the Indian.
Exactly. And so I think sometimes what I'm looking for is just to make sure that we're able to capture those moments as just reminders that it doesn't matter where you are in the ecosystem. We have the power to change someone else's opportunity. And even if we can't do so directly, we have at least bridges, agents that can. So when we talk today, I do want to get a little bit into how the digital divide in general affects populations who are disconnected, and thinking about what does it cost us, as whether it's as a nation, a society, household. Think about it on whatever metric, whatever level you want to think about it, but it always costs us something when people are disconnected. So when we think about how the digital divide impacts civic engagement, I found an interesting example in India because way back in 2012, they were actually one of the largest Facebook users and the largest population of Facebook users. And as the government was thinking about transitioning government services online, one thing that was clear was that even though people might have been able to occasionally get on Facebook with maybe a cell phone or occasional access in some Wi-Fi hotspot in their village, the government actually had to take some sort of action to make sure that as a group, people had reliable access to high-speed internet. And so they actually launched Digital India to actually intentionally build digital infrastructure in hard-to-reach villages. And it was all because they were thinking, if we're going to transition government services online, we still have to make sure that people are able to get on board. To date, over $68 billion has been invested into those projects, and specifically into digital literacy projects to make sure that people not only have access, but that they know how to use it. When we think about how the digital divide impacts our workforce, I think it's always really important that when we talk about all of these aspirational goals as a country here in the US about being able to have the workforce that is a 22nd century workforce, the kind of workforce that can be in a knowledge-based economy with higher salaries and being able to be a little bit more adept and thinking about technology and innovation, that is all reliant on people having some sort of reliable access in their neighborhoods. So that means that when we're talking about remote learning possibilities, they have to have somewhere to plug in and then the equipment to do so. And I thought it was interesting that there was a Chinese think tank called the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences that made, in part of their paper, they essentially warned that in general that the younger population, also their higher end, their higher earners would be able to be fine. They were not worried about future of work issues at all. Who they were worried about were the people that were the elderly, the people that were the low income, also the people who were factory workers or maybe stuck in jobs where they worked with their hands, because those were the people least likely to have digital access on an ongoing basis. So when we think about how that impacts future of work, I think it's always important for us to be able to put it in a metric that policymakers, scientists like yourself, community leaders, something that people understand, because it's not enough for us to just say there's a loss to the household, maybe in lost income, maybe in a lower wage, but there's also a loss to the community where they contribute. And then there's a loss to that larger economy, whether it's a county or a state. And then there's a larger impact on the GDP. And so there's this residual impact. And so we always have to be thinking about, it's not just about the loss to the household, that essentially there's a far-reaching impact if we don't think about giving people opportunities to get online and get trained for the future of our workforce. When we think about how it is impacting innovation, I think all the time about the fact that to this day, the continent of Africa is the most disconnected on the globe, aside from Antarctica and I think it was just Antarctica, because they don't have the numbers really. I think that's why. But when they're looking at continents, the truth is that they remain highly disconnected and still have one of the largest populations. And when we think about that whole idea that as we transition, it's nothing wrong with a goods and services-based economy, but when we look at goods and services-based economies side by side with knowledge-based, one of the best examples of where enormous wealth and enormous poverty live side by side is in the city of San Francisco. And when you go outside of San Francisco, you can actually drift into suburban and also then rural areas very quickly. But when you look in the center of the city where people are making exponentially more than people even 20 miles away from their front doors, we literally have two economies colliding. And what do you have there? Some of the highest homelessness in the nation. So we have to really be thinking about what are the implications if we just say, oh, no big deal. These people are making money, but we just want a more simple life in Kentucky, but there's still a cost. And so we have to really think about what's the residual effect of that. In my work specifically, I always think about what happens when you do have universal access and all of the opportunities that it unlocks. And the fact that when you have more people actually doing research, and I was at an Internet Society event, and one of the things that was one of the coolest things that they said, what is the thing you are most proud of? And we were talking to somebody in the tech company, and he said, I'm so proud that I get to contribute to right now at this moment, my children have access to the most information than any other time in history right now. And if we're really thinking about what does that mean, where we have an entire pool of people who can do instantaneous research that's also dependent on them having access to the same information at the same time, we have more innovation, we find more efficiencies, and are able to reinvest in those communities and create economic mobility for people who would otherwise be stuck in cycles of poverty. So I think that it's important when we talk about them, not just in some clinical case study sense. If we look at the continent of Africa, where we have over 1 billion people, but we have almost 40%, 60% of the population that still does not have reliable access, and that's in 2019. So we have to be asking really hard questions about what are we losing, not just in terms of what they don't have in their households, what they don't have in their economies, but what are we losing in terms of talent that we can't tap into? What are we losing in terms of innovation that could be coming from those regions? So it's always important for us to be asking really hard questions about the opportunity cost. I found a really cool project, Project Mawingu. It means cloud in Swahili, and it's an example of a public-private partnership that I believe Microsoft was doing in the villages, where they were actually using white space, which is spectrum, otherwise used for television broadcasts, but it's essentially that white space in between your channels. And they were using it for Wi-Fi hotspots that they were planting around the villages to essentially get to hard-to-reach places. This is actually something that people do here in the United States in hard-to-reach places, especially in tribal communities where industry feels like there's not really the dollars and cents case to go there. And so these are ways that we can actually give communities an opportunity to be self-sufficient by creating their own Wi-Fi access. Next, I want to bring up something that came up in the earlier panel as we talk about data security. And one of the questions that I believe it was Jennifer got was about ownership of data. And I think that there was a question about last year, there were a couple of tech companies that were floating the idea about what would it be like if we paid users for their data, and that would be so cool because we would own it. And I just want to remind everybody, the people who are going to sign up to sell their data are the people who are in the most dire straits. Because I don't know a lot of people that have a lot of options that are willing to share their information or their data profile in perpetuity. So let's just think about the equitable, the other piece. Like, once you do it, then what happens? And who do these people belong to? Because essentially, your data profile is going to be your fingerprint for the rest of your life. And there's no real longitudinal studies to show at this point, what does it mean when you have an individual who's been under some sort of online surveillance for a lifetime, because the internet is essentially only 20 years old. So we don't have that much research on that. But we do have to ask hard questions about what happens to this information that lives online in perpetuity. Who has ownership? Even if I co-own it with somebody, do I have the right to then pull back and change my mind? And the reason why people aren't really pushing back on some of those, some civil rights advocates did push back immediately, but the reason why that wasn't met with some like visceral reaction, which it should have been, is because the people who are most likely to be taken advantage of don't always have someone to speak up for them. Again, those are the people who do not have the capacity or the agency to speak for themselves, and when we have the opportunities, we have an obligation to do so. So when we think about how the digital divide affects online security, we should always be in the back of our minds aware of the fact that the people who have the most disposable income, the opportunities to pay for that extra security protection, the people who can call their Amex to get them to resolve a dispute, those are the people who are going to have the most secure profiles. And the people who maybe don't have the same additional resources or the digital literacy to navigate some of those settings that might be able to make them more secure, some of them simply don't know how to actually activate those protections. So it is up to us to ask really hard questions of tech companies to make sure that as they are building these models and making sure that our these online portals are secure, and we have to keep asking questions because they are listening. Next, I want to talk a little bit about how the digital divide affects education. And very often here in the US, it's constantly called the homework gap. And by 2018 estimates, approximately 12 million students did not have access to internet at home. And yet, increasingly, teachers are giving homework that actually requires them to have some sort of online access. The devastating part of this story is that the people most likely to be impacted from this are the poor and communities of color. The most beautiful part of this story is that it took teachers and librarians and people banding together to come up with some really amazing ideas to take ownership of this problem in their communities and say that we're not going to let our kids fail. So in West Virginia, when there was a group of science students, I believe it was he works over at Rural Strategies, Center for Rural Strategies. He said, what are we going to do? They started literally putting Wi-Fi on buses, and they would tell you what day it was coming through your neighborhood. So one neighborhood might be Tuesday, one neighborhood it might be Thursday, and that's where they started in West Virginia. And this is now something that Google actually supports many initiatives that happen in different states across the country, but the important part of that piece was that it happened because citizens demanded that people do better. And when you think about people checking out Wi-Fi hotspots in libraries that started in New York, where librarians said, we are essentially mediators, we are healers in this community, we can find a way to give people an opportunity to take this home, and they literally created a way for people to check it out like a book. And so you could check out your Wi-Fi access and have a hotspot at home. It happens in libraries in New York, California, Michigan, but all of that started because citizens took action. It brings me to something that is a question that we always should be thinking about, is whether or not internet access is a human right. And for me, when I think about the way that some of those citizens banded together to make sure that their kids had access, or the way that certain digital rights advocates have demanded that tech companies that are operating in their communities actually also fund digital literacy and digital access initiatives, it's because if it's not a right, then what? Because all of these people who are still living in an analog world, who are literally disenfranchised, will have no opportunity to participate in the digital economy. In 2016, the United Nations essentially declared that the internet access is a human right, and they specifically cited its potential to accelerate human progress. And we know that. We see the examples. The truth is that if we had to live without access for an entire day, it would probably be difficult. I think that if you left home without your wallet, maybe you'd leave for the day. If you left home without your phone, could you survive? That is your walking computer. And so when we think about it, if we don't think it's a right, then why? Because the truth is the people who have the luxury of saying that it's not a right are probably connected. When you think about the digital divide as it impacts the United States, by low estimates, over 20 million people in the United States today have no access to internet of any kind. That is frightening, because while some of them, it might be by choice, some of them, they don't have a choice. So what are we doing about it? First, I think we need to be authentic about who's affected by the digital divide. They are most likely to be people in communities of color. Even though Asians are not included in this metric, they are actually usually earlier adopters. But for people living on tribal lands, indigenous communities, they are some of the most disconnected people in our country. To this day, almost 50% of them still do not have access if you live on tribal lands. And quite frankly, that is just unacceptable. And when we think about also why, when we have a marketplace where essentially companies decide on where they'll go based on where they'll be rewarded in the market, a lot of the times we have to be thinking, if we created this system, is it working? And if it is, for whom? Because the United States still, every single year, ranks top 20 for the most expensive internet in the world. And I just ask why. When we think about ways that we can actually get involved in conversations, at least here in the US, the Federal Communications Commission is the agency that is actually assigned to help address the digital divide. They have a congressional mandate to actually connect disconnected communities, and they're responsible for creating policies and also data sets to show who is connected and to actually assign resources through the universal service funds. They are actually solicit public comments for proposals, and a lot of people don't know you do not need to be a lawyer to engage and solicit in submitting comments to the FCC. You can actually just go online and submit a comment, tell what's happening in your community, and believe it or not, some of those letters are sometimes cited in the notices of proposed rulemakings. For my organization in particular, we focus on self-sufficiency and supporting local solutions. We are always focused on who are the people that are most invested in communities, the people who actually understand the challenges in that community, because the challenges that they face in Detroit is going to be very different than the challenges that a community leader faces in Spring, Texas. And so sometimes it's being able to find the right champion, sometimes it's being able to find the right model, thinking about, do you want to build a municipal model, a municipal network, or have an open access network? There are lots of ways that we can get there, but our duty is to make sure that we provide information for people that are at every stage in the process. I also acknowledge that not everybody in the community is always going to have the capacity to engage at a federal or even a state level, but we encourage people constantly to say something. Now, these are examples of communities that have actually taken connectivity into their own hands. Some of these examples, like for example, in Lafayette, Louisiana, they built a municipal network when back 10 years ago in 2009, they actually went to their telephone and cable company and they said, we need you to provide better access to our residents. The cable and telephone company said, we're good, we're not going to build any additional infrastructure right now, we're in a good place, and they declined the offer. So this city took it into their own hands and built a municipal network that actually serves other cities and counties that are on the perimeter of that city. It is now a profitable and completely separate agency from the city. And so when I think about that model of how they created that in Lafayette, that was just love. They actually declared it as a fourth utility. They said every single one of our residents deserves a right to it. When I think about what's going on in Chattanooga, Tennessee, or Amon, Idaho, where places who actually created their own networks. In Chattanooga, they have some of the fastest internet for some of the lowest prices in the country. And Amon, Idaho is actually just celebrated for being able to provide gigabit speed at $10 per household. That is insane. Because if we can find a way to do it there, I don't know why I pay $100 for Verizon in DC. And so the thing is, we have to be thinking about there are ways that we can get there and connect people, but we have to have not just the political will, it takes citizenry for people to say, we need to do better in these communities. Whenever we're thinking about actually doing some sort of outreach, I always encourage people, if you're thinking about it in your community, if you're thinking about it with your school or maybe with your institution, we need to make sure that we're engaging with people before you actually need them. Tell them what you're doing, tell them what you want, make a specific ask, share your ideas with them on a regular basis. They may not respond, but they're watching, they're listening, they're reading your notices. And I think that it's important when we're talking to the public to be able to meet people where they are. The way that I talk to people in person is going to be very different if I were talking to an FCC commissioner or even drafting a filing. And I think that it doesn't help when we go and shame people into using big terminology that they don't understand. I think everybody understands wanting opportunity. I think everybody understands wanting to be connected. And I don't think we need to explain to them all sorts of things that are happening in a notice for proposed rulemaking to make them care about it. I think we just need to meet people where they are. Finally, I want to think about when you were sharing earlier, I asked you to tell what someone would find out about you on the internet. And I think all the time about what is that going to be like 50 years from now when this information that maybe somebody collected about you in like 1993 lives on in perpetuity online and you don't know how to delete it and you don't know what to do. And I think about what are the ramifications of that and how do we even work through that? And the truth is I have the luxury of being able to say, oh, can I get somebody to curate my Google search or to maybe manipulate my data profile? but there are millions of people who are just barely able to get online. There are millions of people who still have to take the day off of work to update their driver's license, where we can do it on our phone. And so I constantly want to make sure that we're always humanizing that story of being disconnected, because again, when people are operating in the dark, all of us who are in the light still pay a price for that. So I encourage you, when I'm thinking about this room full of leaders and great thinkers, that there are ways for us to solve this problem. And I'm always thinking about what is the story that people will tell about us. And so I'll tell you my story, but I want you to be thinking about your own. My name is Francella Ochillo. I am first-generation American, born of Antiguan and Kenyan immigrants who used education to escape poverty. They traveled thousands of miles and essentially got out of their countries with visas and scholarships because they were the best in class. They managed to get to the United States. They also managed to collect 8 college degrees between the two of them and moved to the desegregated South, where they started a life as academics. For me, I grew up in Louisiana. It is a place that is filled with adventure and disappointment and delight. It is a place that I think all the time about the good and evil that meets face to face, and it's still always tender to me. My name pays homage to, my first name pays homage to my grandfather's work in the Royal British Army, and my last name is a tribute to the Lua people of East Africa. And I am a digital rights advocate here in Washington, D.C., and I get to work on one of the most important issues of our time. I think all the time about the power that I have, even just as citizen, to change who is connected. Will they be able to tell their own story? And where will my story live if I don't have digital access? So I encourage each of you in this room to think about, what story will they tell about you? What story will they tell about your work? Think about the fact that we are at the cusp of a digital revolution, and we have the opportunity to connect every single human being on the planet to be able to participate. So I ask you to join me and to speak up on behalf of the people who cannot speak for themselves. Thank you for having me tonight.